All right, we will go ahead and get started. Good morning, everybody, and thank you for joining the call today. We appreciate you taking the time this morning to hop on. My name is Mallory Lansing, and I'm a field marketing manager with Corteva AgriScience. So the goal of today's session is to walk through the Enlist Weed Control System and key application considerations, and just to make sure our retail partners and applicators have the information that they need heading into the season. So we'll start off with a quick season recap and overview of the Enlist Weed Control System. Then we'll move into traits, program approach, and application considerations and label requirements. We will pause twice during the session to address any questions. But if you have questions during the presentation as we're going through, please submit them through the Zoom Q&A feature, and we will be sure to address them during our question breaks. But joining us today, we have our market development specialists, Brad Burkhart and Grant Harms, who will be walking us through the training. So with that, I will turn it over to Brad to get us started.
All right, great. Thank you, Mallory. Well, really excited to talk to you all today. Appreciate you taking the time here to join us at Corteva to either, if you're new to the Enlist Weed Control System, or maybe if you've been a part of it before, hopefully you get a couple nuggets out of this training here today. Kind of been on an exciting journey for the last few years, and going to hopefully paint the picture of what we've been doing at Corteva, what we're kind of about, and what we feel like is really important when it comes to the Enlist Weed Control System. But I think it's really good to kind of take a step back and look at kind of where we've come from. So if you look at Enlist Weed Control System, you look at last year's planted acres, we were almost on 65% of the soybean market in the United States. So I think that's a testament to how well this technology has worked since launch, and then it continues to grow. And the reason I think it continues to grow is if you are new to this, I think you'll see the ease of use, the ease of handling, the benefits you have for near zero volatility of the Enlist One herbicide. Talking about tank flexibility, you're able to mix this with glufosinate, which we'll talk later in this presentation about why we want to be doing more of that. Talk about, we have a resilient supply. Enlist One herbicide, Enlist Duo, which we are going to be phasing out, but we will still always have Enlist One, is 100% made in USA. So that's kind of a neat thing from supply resilience. It's made here. One of the things you may have seen if you're on social media, or if you have a neighbor that's used it, we always tag this as a neighbor-friendly herbicide. And the reason we say that, I think when you look at the near zero volatility that you have with Enlist One, as well as the Colex D technology, which is part of the Enlist One formulation, that also helps reduce drift. And Grant will talk a little bit later about things you can do to even help that even further. But just know the technology by itself, Enlist One, has that built into the system, which is really neat and something that nobody else can claim to do today on the market. We've got a lot of third-party data from universities as well as other, cooperators and things in the United States that have used this trait system and used Enlist One herbicide. And I think it consistently goes back to people talking about how well it works and being able to deliver proven weed control. Because at the end of the day, that's why we're planting these traits, right? I come from Indiana and Eastern Illinois, where we're battling water hemp day in and day out. And this is one of our key tools that we use to try to combat that. We'll talk later, though, about, we never want to use Enlist by itself. We want it in a program approach. We always want residuals with effective multiple modes of action. And we'll get into that a little bit as well. So when you look at Enlist herbicide, basically since it's been launched, we got to go back a few years. But since then, we've had over 150 million acres actually sprayed with Enlist herbicides, which is kind of incredible when you think about it. It continues to gain market share year after year. I already talked about, over 65% in the market. But if you look at the spray rate that we have with Enlist, and I think this is testament to the technology of how well it does work, we're over 75% of using Enlist One or Enlist Duo on the Enlist traits, which is really, really a clear difference, I think, when you compare it to some of the other trait systems that are on the market. Just for full disclosure, dicamba did get re-registration of the federal label. But, I challenge you to look at some of the differences with the technology. We don't have cutoff dates. There's a lot less restrictions when it comes to our technology. And I think as you go through this applicator training, whether you're a farmer, farmer applied, you're an applicator at a retailer. There's peace of mind when it comes to Enlist, and I think that's why we truly shine at the end of the day. So let's talk about the Enlist Weed Control System. And we always talk about it as a weed control system. And the reason is, if you go back a little bit in our history, I've been around a while, starting to get a little gray hair, but we launched the Enlist Ahead, which is one of the pillars of the Enlist Weed Control System. So when we look at this whole Enlist trait lineup, the herbicide, as well as this Enlist Ahead piece, it is a total system. It's a total package. And what I mean by that, it's not just the traits, it's not just the herbicide, it is also the Enlist Ahead. And you'll say, what is Enlist Ahead? Enlist Ahead was basically our commitment to the industry, to you as the farmer, you as the retailer, that we want this technology to be used right, to be around for the future, and to continue to be used, because it is a very, very important tool. We actually launched the Enlist Ahead well before we even got our herbicide registered. So it was actually launched in 2012. Not a lot of people know that, but our stewardship almost resource was launched 3 years before we even had actual commercial registration, which I think is a testament to our company and what we try to do the right thing in the market. So 2015, we had the first registration. 2016, cotton was launched. And then 2019 is kind of when we really got into accelerating and ramp up with the soybeans on the acre. So if you look at where we've gone and I guess where we're going, it's in Indiana and Illinois. It's rapidly increased. It's extremely increased over the last couple of years, and I think you can see the technology is there's proof in the pudding. We got leading traits and genetics in these soybeans, and then you have a great solution that you can be able to use with that. So I talked about the herbicides. So if you don't know what Enlist One or Enlist Duo is, what the traits enable the soybeans to do is have tolerance to 2,4-D choline, and that is a proprietary product from Corteva. That's Enlist One or Enlist Duo. It also has tolerance for glyphosate as well as glufosinate. So you're able to use basically 3 different products in a crop to use those multiple modes of actions, and we'll talk a little bit more about that later. What you may not be aware of, you probably knew about the soybean piece. There we go. So we talk about having those 2,4-D traits built into the system. This right here is what I call a glamour picture. We like to prove, hey, what can you actually do in these soybeans? And when I talk about Enlist traits in our products, they are a very, very robust trait. So here you have an example of Enlist Duo herbicide. So that is actually a premix of Enlist One and glyphosate, which I told you earlier we're going to be phasing out. We're really just focused on Enlist One. But when we did this trial study, on the left side of the screen, you have basically a 1x rate of the Enlist Duo. And then on the right side of the screen, you have a 2x rate, just to show, you don't see any basically really crop symptomology besides a little bit of necrosis. And that's mainly coming from the AMS and surfactant that's in that load. So the crop tolerance is extremely, extremely good. And the trait is super, super robust. So talked about soybeans, but let's talk a little bit about something you may not be aware of. We are launching Enlist corn. It was actually launched, a few years ago, but we're really starting to ramp it up. And you may be thinking, okay, corn already has some natural tolerances to 2,4-D, but what you got to think about is what would happen if you applied 2,4-D a little bit later on corn? You could get leaning, you could get brittle snap, you could get brace root damage. This new 2,4-D trait that is going to be in the Enlist corn enables us to use Enlist One in corn and not have those risks. And also extends the label a little bit later. So we're able to spray Enlist One later in corn, which is a really nice benefit, especially if you've got some of those tough to control water hemp. So Enlist corn, just so we're clear what traits you're able to have in there. You've got the 2,4-D trait again, the 2,4-D choline. It's got glyphosate tolerance, glufosinate tolerance. And the last piece that's also very new is a FOP tolerance. So you could spray things like Assure 2 actually in corn to kill some tough to control grasses. Here in southern Indiana, we get down to Kentucky, we've got a couple grasses that actually pretty excited to be able to use some Enlist corn in to be able to clean some of that up. So it's going to be a nice tool. Last but not least, we launched cotton first, so I'll talk about this last. Now, I'm not a cotton expert, but Enlist Cotton has been a great tool in the South. It launched in 2017, and over 90% of the varieties now contain the W3FE trait. Same thing like soybeans, though. It is a 2,4-D choline tolerant, glyphosate tolerant, and glufosinate. So another great tool to be able to use in cotton. When we think about, drift and volatility, cotton's very sensitive. So if you didn't have a traded cotton, you're thinking, oh my gosh, you're kind of scared maybe to spray 2,4-D choline. Well, reality is we're on a ton of acres out there, and we have yet to really have a complaint. And that is because the attestament to the technology that is in Enlist One. And I'll talk about that here in a little bit. Just to put the proof in the pudding again, we've got some more glamour pictures, if you will, of looking at two different, products that are on the market. And on the left side, you have the Enlist cotton. On the right side, you have the Extend cotton. Okay, so Enlist One and Enlist Duo herbicides. Just to make sure you guys know exactly what they are again, I just want to reiterate what they are. Enlist Duo is that glyphosate Enlist One tank mix. That's nice because it's got a convenient premix, but we are phasing that out as Corteva just because we see a lot more people wanting just a straight goods Enlist One technology. And the reason is for that is because I think a lot more people are mixing Enlist One with glufosinate, the Liberty trait, and being able to have those a contact and a systemic herbicide together to really go after those tough to control weeds. When you look at the weeds that are out there, like I told you, I mentioned water hemp already. Palmer's a big one in the South. We've got a few pockets of it that's starting to be issues, but most of the pig weeds, we do an excellent job of controlling. Mare's tail, giant rag, common rag, velvet leaf. You get up into Grant's area, he'll talk about maybe kochia again later, but really excellent technology to be able to use that growth regulator on those tough to control weeds. So I've mentioned a lot about 2,4-D choline, and you may be thinking, what is that? 2,4-D choline is actually a brand new form of 2,4-D. 2,4-D has been around. It's one of the oldest products on the market. But when you come down to looking at these things on an acid equivalent basis, and that's what we do as Corteva and chemist people, they look at these products and like, how can we take these molecules and create them with more desired attributes? So one of the risks of 2,4-D, amine or ester, is potential volatility. So what Corteva did many years ago, I think probably starting back 2005 to 2004 or 5, they were doing a lot of research to figure out how could we make 2,4-D less volatile. Well, we figured it out. And this chart basically shows traditional 2,4-D ester here on the right of your screen, looking at basically how much vapor loss you would get after 70 hours of treatment. So that's where we're talking about volatility. The next bar graph is 2,4-D amine, and that last one is 2,4-D choline. What you look at is it's basically near zero volatility from 2,4-D choline. It's a 96% reduction versus the ester formulation. So you think about traditional 2,4-D ester versus 2,4-D choline, it's 96% less. And how we achieve that is basically there's a extra chlorine group on this. It's a charged acid, so therefore that basically can't get up and move is what happens. So 2,4-D choline is way less volatile. Hopefully you guys are hearing that and believe that. If you have used it, I know you've probably seen it. Grant's going to talk about sensitive areas and sensitive crops, and I think this will make a lot more sense later when you see some of the things that he's going to talk about. So if you want to compare us to some other technologies that are on the market, we look at dicamba. And when you compare Enlist Duo versus a dicamba on an acid-acid basis, it's actually 236% less volatile. The magnitude of that is, it's almost off the charts. And there's, I talked about how many acres we're on and what we've been able to do as Corteva. The reason is because of this. It is because this product, if you use it in the right parameters, it will stay on target. It goes where it's supposed to go. So, and Gray will talk a little bit later about what to make sure to get there. So, question comes up a lot. Unfortunately. Enlist One herbicide, Enlist Duo herbicides are the only products that are registered to go pre and post with Enlist crops. I get the question asked a lot about, post emerge. Could I use just any LV6 off the shelf? Well, hopefully what you just saw in those last couple of slides the technology that we have built into Enlist One and Enlist Duo, you would want to be using Enlist One, Enlist Duo post emerge. And then, oh, by the way, it is illegal if you do that. Okay. So there's risks that you could have if you do that. And I'll talk a little bit about what we're doing to try to help steward that technology and make sure it's around here for the future. So just to be clear, you cannot use any other 2,4-D containing products post emerge there on Enlist crops. So let's talk about Enlist Ahead. So we mentioned, we launched that 2012. What actually is it? So there's kind of three pillars inside the Enlist Ahead. There's a management resource where we've got application guides, product use guides. We've actually even have an app. We got a lot of fact sheets, in-field experts like Grant and I. We're out every day doing trainings like this with our local retailers, with our different farmers, different operations, different seed partners to try to make sure that people are using this technology right and being able to have them have the best success rate that they can. So what else do we do in the Enlist Ahead? We've got an education and training pillar. So we do field trainings. Every year we do in-field demonstrations, look at, hey, let's treat a plat of soil and actually try to make it volatilize and prove like this stuff, we call it a low volatility tunnel, and basically show that it doesn't get up and move. We try to actually break the system. We do webinars like you're here today, and really glad you're here to hopefully take a couple nuggets away. We've got libraries. I do want to point out, and I don't want to be remiss because I'll forget to say it. If you go to enlist.com, there is a ton of resources, everything from nozzles that are approved, from tank mix partners that are approved, all the way to all these different product use guides and things like that. The last piece is the technology advancements that we've been able to do with Enlist. Having that 2,4-D choline that I've talked about the last couple of slides, the technology that has enabled us to reduce that volatility. Colex-D technology. I haven't talked a lot about it yet, but that is also another attribute of Enlist One and Enlist Duo. It's actually a built-in Colex-D technology that actually enables about 90% reduction in drift. So you've basically got a drift aid built into the formulation. The other thing we do is we're constantly looking at improving nozzle selection. Sprayers are changing. There's a lot of new pulse sprayers and things like that. So we go out and we test, say, what is the best thing we can do to try to get the right coverage, to get the product on target without having any negative attributes. So we're constantly testing that. The last piece is just looking at our tank mix partners. We're very, very flexible when it comes to tank mix partners. We're not really required to add a lot of things. There's only really, we look at a Liberty Ultra using a high surfactant crop oil or MSO is about our only really real requirement. Everything else, if you go to the Enlist Tank Mix website, you can see how friendly it is. That we'll talk about some of those tank mix partners in a minute. And the last piece is the application flexibility. I mentioned before, we don't have cutoff dates. I mean, we go through R1 by the soybean growth on the label and up to V8 on corn. So there's not a lot of parameters when it comes to that. Okay. So talked about Enlist with Colex-D technology. And just to be clear, and I'm going to reiterate this a few times, it is the only product on the market that has 2,4-D choline is Enlist One and Enlist Duo. If anybody else has sold you something and said this is okay to use on Enlist crops, red flag. Okay, that is not true. That is anywhere far from the truth. Enlist One and Enlist Duo are the only things approved to be able to go on Enlist crops. So, and just to reiterate one more time, talking about that Colex-D technology, that 90% less driftable fines, the reason part of this we achieve this is we work with the EPA as far as mandating what we can tank mix with Enlist One. So the reason we do this is to make sure that anything we do add in Enlist One or Enlist Duo doesn't break the technology and in essence could make it more driftable or volatilized. So we do that testing. Talked already about the reduction in the volatility, and Grant will talk a little bit more about the Endangered Species Act, but Enlist One was actually the first product to be registered and consistent with the ESA Act policy from the United States, which I think is a testament to our technology and us passing through that. So when you sign on to use an Enlist seed, so if you're buying one of our seed partner brands or an affiliate that has the Enlist trait in with them, hopefully everybody's aware that you have signed a TUA, and a TUA is a technology use agreement. And basically that's an agreement between you and Corteva that you have to do this to have access to the seed technology. In that agreement, it outlines the acceptance that you can only use Enlist One or Enlist Duo on those crops. So making sure that you understand you did do that. So just want to be clear on that. Okay, I'll touch on it one more time. So reiterating, we have the TUAs. When you signed that, you basically made that commitment to us that you are going to use Enlist One or Enlist Duo in crop if you do need to use that as the weed control option. So there is no other 2,4-Ds that can go post in the Enlist One crops. Just to read that, and you may think like, well, yeah, maybe I can get by with something. Well, think about this for a minute. Just paint yourself a picture. If you used maybe a legal application of 2,4-D, and this product would result in an off-target movement, you are going to be responsible. And it's very unlikely that your insurance would cover it because you've already signed a TUA agreement. You could basically lose access to future technology with Enlist traits. So you may not be able to buy Corteva traits. So there's a lot of risk that why somebody would not want to do this and make sure we're doing the right thing. And the last piece that I always mention, we've made this product so well, and like I said, we've had such an increased growth with it. The reason we have is because it does what it's supposed to do. I go back to that old post I saw, I think, on Twitter a few years ago about being neighbor friendly. It is truly a neighbor friendly herbicide because it stays where it's supposed to go. And then, oh, by the way, it does a really good job of killing weeds. Okay, so with that, something new that is actually we've been doing here the last couple of years. If you know of someone, or if maybe your neighbor is maybe not probably doing the right thing, we do have a way to protect this trait, and you can do it anonymously. There's actually a report, basically unauthorized use or seed use by contacting this number on the screen, 1-844-733-3847. And basically, we've done this to make sure we can protect this technology. When we look at the market and the companies, all the other companies in the market, there's not a lot of new technology. So we have to do everything we can to protect this technology for the future, because otherwise we're not going to have a lot of tools. And I think that's the reason we've kind of had to go down this path a little bit. So most people, I'll give you 98% the benefit of the doubt. People do the right thing, but there's always a bad egg somewhere. And so that's why we have this as an option. So, we're constantly evaluating how we use Enlist. And we look at these TUAs and look at these audits. When you sign that TUA, you basically could have an audit. Now, we don't go out there and just do that, but the reality is we want people to be doing the right thing. It always goes back to the golden rule, and hopefully we've covered that enough. The last thing in the last 5 minutes before I turn it over to Grant, I always want to talk about a program approach when it comes to Enlist. Like I mentioned in the beginning, it's a 3-pillared system with the herbicide, the traits, and then also the Enlist ahead piece. Really, the 4th pillar is you have to have good quality residuals and in-crop residuals with these products. So if we're designing a corn program, let's say you have Enlist corn next year, hopefully you're doing a good burn down early to control those weeds, or you're working the ground, depending where you're at. You've got the Enlist corn traits, so that's going to be 4-seed, Power Core Ultra. Depending where you're at, there's going to be a lot of different brands. But the key here is then applying a soil residual. And so when I look at, if you're in Indiana, Resicor Rev is probably our number one product. It's a premix of 3 effective modes of action on water hemp. We're putting that down pre, and then we're maybe coming in post with Cairo. It's one of our newest corn herbicides. It's also got 3 modes of action in it, and we're tank mixing that with Enlist One. So in essence, you've got 4 modes of action going in that crop post with that Enlist One piece. So I think it's key to always have multiple effective sites of action, especially for us where we're at. And I know a lot of people probably on this call are fighting water hemp or palmer. So making sure you're using those multiple modes of action and doing what we can. Looking at a soybean program approach, same thing here. Start with a good early burn down. We've got some new products from Corteva this year, Sonic Boom, and then Kyber Pro. Kyber Pro is probably one of our Cadillac programs, having those multiple modes of action basically built in. We're making sure we keep water hemp from basically not germinating. And then the program approach would be, hey, go by the calendar, count your 21, 28 days later, and then layer in that Enlist One plus Inversa and potentially Liberty, right? So that'd be an option to be able to do that to combat those weeds. Cotton, same story. And you're going to hear this every time. You're starting with a good burn down, using products like Everprex, Staple as a residual, coming in crop, Enlist One, and glufosinate or glyphosate. And we're never going to go Enlist One by itself. I want to make sure everybody hears that. So quick BMPs for controlling, making sure you have effective weed control with these products is using the full application rate. So Enlist One rate is 2 pints to the acre. Enlist Duo 4.75 pints. The big key that I always talk about is making sure we spray weeds that are 2 to 3 inches tall. On the label, it says up to 6 inches. When you think about water hemp and how many growing points it could have after 6 inches, that's the reason we say that, because if you effectively don't get that coverage, you are going to miss that weed. You want to spray when weeds are actively growing. You got to make sure the weather is right. If it's been super dry for 4 days, you may not have great weed control. We talked about using full rates. Grant's going to talk about nozzles, but the key is having the best coverage we can with these products. Talk about pressure. I like to be in that upper third range of the pressure spectrum, depending on your nozzles. And I think that's very important. Water carrier. I like 15. If you're using it with Enlist and Liberty, up to, I'd say 20 GPA is where I would start. Okay. So making sure you got enough water. And the last piece is looking at other adjuvants, depending on your conditions and what's going on, is adding possibly crop oil or adding in MSO, and definitely making sure we got AMS in the tank mix. I talked about water hemp and the growing points. Here's an example of a 6-inch tall, water hemp palmer here. The key is you've got to get coverage on all those axillary buds. If one of those points doesn't get coverage, you have a chance of missing that weed. And that's what I always harp on people. They say, oh, I'm going out there a 6-inch weed. A lot of times, if you take a tape measure out there, they're 8, 10, 12 inches tall. We can't be spraying. I used to call them trophy weeds. That's my old joke from Southern Indiana. But you start spraying trophy weeds, eventually you get to keep a lot of trophies. And these are the trophies you do not want to keep, because they produce 300 to 500,000 seeds per plant, and they will be a beast for the next year. So spray small weeds, go earlier than waiting. I know the biggest thing I see year in and year out is we do a good job of using soil residuals, but then my field still looks clean, so I kind of wait a little bit. We can't let water hemp or palmer get ahead of us. Okay. I talked about tank mix partners. Just to be clear on this, this is an EPA mandated drift test protocol, so we're making sure that we are protecting those sensitive areas, and that anything that we're adding wouldn't basically negatively affect the Enlist One or Enlist Duo technology. So we do that to protect the sensitive areas where the endangered species might actually habitate. So if we don't do that, we would have a problem. So make sure to go to the website and check to make sure whatever you are tank mixing with Enlist One or Enlist Duo is labeled, because if they are labeled, they have passed this test for that EPA mandate. And that we do that because we're partnering with the EPA. But one thing I want to caution you, when we test these products, we don't have enough time. We have so many products. We can't test these for crop response. Some of these things, you can have large tank mixes that can heat up the tank mix. We can't control all that. So that's one thing I'll caution you. We don't test for crop response. We don't test for tank mix compatibility. And we really don't check for, is it a based on agronomic recommendation? It's not an endorsement by us. It is strictly like, hey, these pass the wind tunnel study test. It is not going to negatively affect the product. It won't make it go any more off target. But outside of that, you're kind of up to you to be as a steward of that. Last piece I got before I turn it over to Grant is talking about water hemp again. When we look at Enlist One plus glufosinate, it is hands down the best tank mix on the market, making sure you got AMS, doing all those parameters I talked about earlier. When you compare it to just using glyphosate or just glufosinate by itself, we see a great increase in control. So if you looked at this chart and just, it's kind of an eye chart a little bit, but you're looking at 2 post passes, basically a sequential pass on water hemp, 15 days apart. The top bar is basically showing across the board is showing you what the tank mixes are. Then we have the control ratings, and then we have the post passed again with what was in those, as well as the control ratings. And the green bar, the reason we're drawing your attention to that, if you look at the Enlist One plus glufosinate, you're getting about a 91% control versus, if you're just glufosinate alone, you're at 82%. And that's where we're showing some of these increases with that. So if you have any takeaway today, besides making sure we're using Enlist on in crop, is tank mixing it probably with Liberty. If you haven't done it before, I challenge you to do it because it is a true differentiator, having a contact and a systemic herbicide in that tank mix and having those two effective modes of action, plus using a soil residual like Conversa with that to control any new water hemp from coming is where I would be looking at to go. Sorry, I missed something there. Oh, I already talked about it. Oh, I want to highlight it again though. So a lot of times I'll hear, well, we'll just maybe run Liberty on the first pass and then come back with Enlist. And I want to get that out of your head, because if you use the two together the first time, you're much better ahead of those weeds versus trying to come back and maybe kill a weed that was injured. Same thing for Palmer. It's even more dramatic. Our control that we see from Palmer increases almost 43% versus glyphosate alone. And so I think that just these numbers kind of speak for themselves, looking at the Enlist one versus glufosinate alone, or glyphosate and glufosinate. That is all I had about 30 minutes there. We are now going to pause in case anybody has any questions for kind of what I just covered. And Grant and I will do our best to answer any if there is any.
So I'm not seeing any in the chat or in the Q&A, but let's go ahead and take 2 or 3 minutes to capture any questions while we've got kind of a little section right here. But for the participants, at the bottom of the screen, you can see Q&A with a question mark on it. If you click on that, you can type in your questions and we can get Brad and Grant to answer them for you.
And I guess if you're looking to ask questions about label requirements or more technical questions that may be found on the label, that's more about what I'm going to get into. So if you're looking for questions that revolve around our Enlist One label, that'll be session 2 here, which will start up shortly.
I see one question on the wind parameters using Enlist One. I'm going to hold off on that one. Grant's going to cover it here soon. Okay, Brad, we've got one. If using Enlist One plus Liberty without Roundup, can adequate grass control be expected from the Liberty component?
Great question. Typically what we do, we would add in another grass killer like a clethodim, is what we typically do to ensure to get that grass control. And just so we're level set, can be some antagonism with that. So we typically up the rate of those other post grass killers with that about a third. So depending on what product you'd be using, we typically go up by about a third because of that antagonism. So Liberty's not going to give you enough control on that on a lot of those grasses. So that's typically what we do is tank mix it with that. Grant, I pretty much covered that, didn't I?
Yep. I always like to look at, is the grass established? Is it glyphosate resistant grass? Then we lean on the corn killer chemistry and increase that rate to get to a sufficient rate to kill the grass there. But if it's established grasses, sometimes I like, throwing glyphosate into the mixture to get those harder control grasses. But in general, if we're throwing in the corn killer and elevating that rate of the corn killer, Enlist One, corn killer, Liberty, AMS, surfactant usually gets the job done.
I did see another question about drone applications. So we're not labeled aerially to be applied Enlist One. So I did want to address that one. That one's pretty easy to answer.
It looks like everything else will be covered in the next section.
Wind parameters. Yeah, it's mostly Grant.
Yep.
Yeah, so we'll turn it over to Grant to go through the next couple of sections.
Great deal. My name is Grant Harms. I live in Sioux Falls, South Dakota. I was a rep for 10 years for Corteva, and today I'm a market development specialist covering the Northern Plains, which for Corteva, that basically means North Dakota, South Dakota, Montana, and Wyoming. So been around the system, and I use that word quite frequently. It's a system. Not everything that we talk about today will be utilized, but as weeds evolve, which is inevitable, the system will be needed because Mother Nature really is good at what she does. And a lot of times these weeds are getting harder to control every year in and year out. So using the system, using the layered residuals, it's just a tool in the tool belt that we're happy to have and happy to have been selling for almost half a decade now. So I'm going to jump into a little bit more of what's actually on the label. A lot of you have requirements by your organizations, by local governmental agencies, by the EPA that we just got to make sure when we're spraying these chemistries, we're doing what's right and making sure these chemistries are around for the long haul. Because as water hemp, palmer, kochia, as all these weeds get harder to control, if we lose chemistries, kind of like what we did with dicamba a couple of years back due to off-label applications, if we're losing chemistries, our tool belt starts to get a little slim. So I'm going to jump into, approved nozzles and the pressure range for those nozzles. We're going to talk about additional adjuvants. What are we seeing? The Enlist label is somewhat vague when it comes to adjuvants, and that's due to all the tank mix partners we see in the industry. So a lot of times Enlist is not going out as a standalone chemistry. Therefore, we kind of have to look at what is in the tank mix and what do those tank mix partners require when it comes to adjuvants. Also going to talk about sensitive areas versus susceptible areas and what that means for spray buffers. And then spray versus no spray field scenarios. We'll give you some examples. The Endangered Species Act, that is somewhat new. I think Brad mentioned the Enlist One chemistry was the first product to go through that ESA checkoff list, and we'll just show you what the ESA requirements are for Enlist One, and then we'll also just talk about runoff mitigations strategies in general. So to keep it high level and not get into a 20-page label, these are some of the main points that we look at when we want to have success with Enlist. So the application window, are we spraying when weeds are less than 6 inches tall? Once they get to 3-4 inch tall, talking water hemp specifically here, once water hemp gets 4 inches tall, that weed is going to want to grow 1 inch per day if the growing conditions are right. It just really starts to take off once it gets a root system underneath it. So trying to get weeds when they're manageable, less than 6 inches tall is key. Also, soybeans we can spray through the R1 growth stage. So if you're looking at cutoff restrictions, the only cutoff restriction that we see on the Enlist One label is the R1 growth stage in soybeans. So through R1, it can be tank mixed with Liberty through R1 as well. And in cotton, it's going to be before the first white bloom on that plant. Corn, this is where people are excited with, we're really happy with Enlist and soybeans, but in corn, being able to prevent brittle corn, being able to prevent fused brace roots, being able to tank mix with our HPPD Callisto type chemistries in the marketplace, we can now add Enlist if we need to supercharge a tank mix or spray, road ditches, or maybe we're spraying a soybean field next to Enlist corn. We can spray Enlist in Enlist corn up to V8 growth stage or 30 inches tall. So pretty wide application window. We're not saying wait to the deadline. We always want to be in there a little proactively when the weeds are manageable. And then we always also recommend layered residuals with that application of Enlist One and Liberty. If you do find yourself in a scenario, maybe you're rained out and you need to go in late up to 48 inches tall, we can use drop nozzles with Enlist One. So there is a little bit of a unique situation there if you get rained out really, really bad. Tank mix partners. So the EPA requires us to make sure anything in the tank with Enlist One is not increasing driftable fines. So you will find all the approved Enlist tank mix partners on enlisttankmix.com, and it's pretty wide. There's really not many products out there in the marketplace today that you can't mix with Enlist One, but there are some. So make sure before you spray that everything in your tank mix is approved, is an approved tank mix partner. Multiple effective sites of action. Brad kind of talked about that. He showed the data with Enlist One and Liberty. Early on, I think we were having a lot of success in my neck of the woods going after water hemp with Enlist One and glyphosate because Enlist One was effective, but glyphosate was, there's a lot of water hemp that's resistant to glyphosate. So really agronomically, that was a one mode of action application. And I think a lot of the industry is starting to look at two effective modes of action to target water hemp, and that would be the Enlist One and glufosinate tank mix. Tank mix sequence. We've got a lot of literature on Enlist Ahead, where if you're looking at how to tank mix, in general, we don't want raw chemistry ever touching each other. So when you're mixing and you're putting products into the inductor cone, especially when it comes to K-salt, glyphosates, and Enlist One, you never really want those chemistries to touch in the raw chemistry form. So add your product one by one, add water, make sure there's plenty of water in the tank to bloom your chemistry into, and then rinse those induction cones in between each application of chemistry. Nozzles is another thing that's required by the EPA to keep this product where we want to spray it. And nozzles is going to help with driftable fines. So using the correct nozzle and the right pressure, we'll touch on that. And then the last thing before spraying to think about is sprayer contamination. Are you starting clean? Were you coming from corn? Were you spraying status in corn? Were you spraying something that would negatively affect your soybeans? If that is the case, we want to really look at what was in that sprayer and make sure that sprayer is clean prior to applications of the Enlist system. Spray volume, most acres will get the 15 gallon per acre rate. But again, if you're adding Liberty to the tank mix, the Liberty folks at BASF, they prefer 20 with the Liberty chemistry. A lot of applications at 15, you can go down to 10 if you want to with like Enlist One and glyphosate applications, but coverage is always better, especially when we're trying to go after 4 or 5 inch water hemp. There's a lot of growing points we need to coat with this, let's call it paint, and we need to paint that water hemp and get all those growing points, and 15 gallons is a good starting point. Spray rate. There's really only one rate with Enlist One, especially when you're going after hard to control weeds. 2 pints per acre of Enlist One. If you do have some Enlist Duo in the shed, 4.75 pints per acre is the only use rate with that product that we would recommend today. Spray pressure, we always want to go to the upper range of the allowed range on these nozzles that you're using, and then the height of the boom no more than 24 inches. Just kind of general, common sense sprayer recommendations there. After spraying, because Enlist One is a water-based chemistry, you can flush with water. Water is the best tank cleaner, so flush it once with 10% of the tank volume, and then move on to your triple rinse normal process when triple rinsing. You can use a tank cleaner with that second rinse, but in general, the Enlist One comes out of the spray system pretty easily, being water-based and using water to rinse the system. I'll talk on wind, and I'll talk about susceptible crops, but it's probably best to get off the slide. We've been on it for a minute. All right, here's what I talk about when I say go to Enlist Ahead and find some of our resources that Corteva provides. These are nozzles that the EPA has allowed with the Enlist system. So what that means is Enlist One, when using these nozzles at the preferred pressure range, we're not going to lead to a situation where we are drifting onto our neighbors or allowing the product to move to places other than what we're trying to spray that day. I will say sprayer technology has come along a long ways. There's pulse width modulation systems. There's the aim command system. There's all these different systems that are looking to improve our sprayer systems that are out there. And we have tested a lot of those systems. So you'll see on these documents you could find on Enlist Ahead, there's nozzles for pulse width modulation systems highlighted in red. If you're looking at John Deere Exact Apply systems, they're highlighted in green there with the green box. But in general, the AIXR nozzle is where we like to start people out with your normal spray systems. And here's a little bit more on the AIXR and why we kind of start here when we're looking at nozzles to put on your machine. We're looking for a coarse nozzle, but not ultra coarse. You think about, volleyballs versus basketballs, or softballs versus, basketballs. We're not looking for massive droplets that will essentially not get into the plants we're trying to control. When your droplets are too big, they roll off the weeds. They don't stay on the weeds, and they essentially, you're going to lead to lessened weed control with too big of nozzles. So that's why we really like the AIXR nozzle, especially at 10, 15, 20 gallons per acre, we can provide really good coverage and also not get ourselves in a situation where we're drifting too much. We also like, adjuvants with the system. So Enlist One has Colex-D technology built into it. That is a drift reduction system built into the product. But we know when we're spraying in late June, early July, that a lot of times the weeds we're going after have waxy cuticles. They know how to survive in hot situations. So when temperature gets hot, these weeds get a waxy layer on them, and that's why we really like an oil with our system. Not necessarily for deposition or drift prevention, but this is more deposition, getting the chemistry into the plant. So you look at the top left, that's without any deposition aid. That's just Enlist One and water alone. It's on the plant, but it's not necessarily getting into the plant, especially when those plants are hardened off. Non-ionic surfactant, that's a surfactant that's going to spread the chemistry across the leaf surface, which allows it to get in the plant a little bit better. But then we look at a spreader versus more of a burn it into the plant type mentality. The non-ionic is good, but does it get it into the plant when the weeds are hardened off? Probably not as good as crop oil or MSO. So with our Enlist One Liberty applications, 15 gallons of water, 3 pounds of AMS, we're going to recommend a 1% solution of modified oil, maybe a surfactant oil or crop oil or MSO. And that's where we've had the best luck, especially when we know not every single weed is going to be in every scenario, especially when we get delayed and we can't get to fields in a timely manner because of acres we're trying to cover. In general, this recommendation covers our butts when we're spraying a lot of acres during the summer on a tight timeline. Susceptible crops. So these are crops that we cannot spray. If these crops are downwind, that is a do not spray day with Enlist. So these crops being susceptible crops, cucurbits, watermelons, pumpkins, tobacco, grapes, tomatoes, fruiting vegetables. Think about like garden plants, something grandma or your mom may be growing in the garden that you'd get in trouble if you killed. A lot of these susceptible crops would be a do not spray day. So if the wind is going towards those susceptible crops, that is a do not spray. We need to wait for the wind to change. Compatible crops, this is where the Enlist system is a lot different from other technology. The Enlist system is going to be the backbone of many systems in the future. And that's because when we're using Enlist and Liberty, we can spray when these crops are downwind. So these are Enlist herbicide compatible crops. That doesn't mean you can spray on all these crops. Not all these crops are tolerant to 2,4-D or Liberty or glyphosate. So it doesn't mean you can spray on these crops, but if you're doing everything we've talked about and you're following the label, you're using the right adjuvants and tank mix partners and nozzles and pressure, if these crops are downwind of an Enlist field and you're spraying Enlist One, you can spray up to 15 miles per hour. We prefer 10, but the label would allow up to 15 mile per hour. And obviously, you always got to use a little common sense, but these are compatible crops if downwind. Allows you to continue spraying throughout the day without having to stop and wait for wind changes. It's just a really ease of use benefit that we have with the Enlist Weed Control System. Sensitive areas are a little different. So the EPA basically has set aside what they claim or what they call sensitive areas. And these sensitive areas are places that that we need to protect that potentially can harbor an endangered species. So when I think of endangered species where I live, wooded areas, pastures, roadside ditches, lawns, if these places are a place where endangered species may be living, we've got a 30-foot downwind buffer. So the wind can still be blowing towards these areas, but you're going to have the 30-foot buffer there when you're spraying your Enlist product. And here's some examples. So in this example, if the wind is blowing from the north to the south, so we got the wind coming from the top of the screen down, and we've got non-Enlist soybeans downwind, you can spray. So as long as you have your wind within 3 to 10 miles per hour, no more than 15, you can spray. However, in this scenario, even though the wind direction is correct, just know that, wind never really goes in true straight lines. So if you're next to tomatoes, it may be best if we wait for a west wind. If the wind is coming from the west and going towards the east, towards that enlist corn, that would be a more ideal situation for this area. But in general, if the wind was going from north to south here, you could spray that day, but just use some common sense when next to tomatoes there. Next example here, the wind is blowing from the south to the north. So in this scenario, the wind is coming from those extend soybeans and it's going towards the trees. We know trees can harbor endangered species. So in this scenario, we would have a 30-foot downwind buffer when spraying Enlist on this field. Again, be careful with the tomatoes next to you. And a more ideal situation would be a westwardly wind, where the wind is going from the west to the east, going towards that Enlist corn. That would be more ideal for this scenario. Last example, so east to west. I think everyone could quickly answer this one pretty easily. So if the wind is going east to west towards those tomatoes, that is a do not spray. There are some areas that the Enlist label is not allowed, or we cannot spray Enlist, and that's due to endangered species that could be negatively affected by an application of the Enlist 1 chemistry. So it's intended to conserve and protect endangered and threatened species and their habitats. And you can see it's not widely common, but there are some areas across the U.S. where the ESA process is looking to protect endangered species and threatened species and their habitats. And this isn't unique to the Enlist label. A lot of the new labels coming out today have to go through the ESA, Endangered Species Act process, where we're just trying to do what's right in the industry and protect these sensitive species. Here's what you'll see on the Enlist label for ESA. So to reduce runoff from treated fields to the maximum extent practicable. So we're trying to be practicable here. The applicator must effectively implement measures in the following table. When I look at this table, there's a lot here, but in general, especially where I live, a lot of people get these points pretty quickly. So you're essentially looking to build up points, and we're depending on the soil type. So if you got a soils in group A and B, hydrologic soil groups A and B, we have to rack up 4 points, 4 credits. For land with hydrologic soil groups C and D, we're looking for a minimum of 6 credits. So when you look at ways to, and the hydrologic soil groups are down there, and this is on the label, clearly stated on our label as well. So you don't have to go to a website or anything. It's actually on the label. But when you look at the ways to rack up points, a lot of times we rack up these points without even trying to rack up the points. However, that's not true for every situation. So looking at all these different ways to rack up points and what makes sense for your farm, you may have to actively do something new for specific fields. But in general, we're able to rack up points pretty quickly and get to 4 or 6 credits when we're making the application. So the quickest way to rack up points is 1 application of Enlist on that field. That's worth 4 points right off the gate. If you're doing 2 applications on that field, that's worth 2 points. Residue tillage management, no-till, strip till, ridge till, mulch till, that's worth 4 points. That's pretty common in today's agricultural practices, so that's worth 4. So if you look at the first 2 options there, you're pretty much at 6. But if you didn't reach 6 or 4 there, you can go to vegetative filter strips. So 30-foot off-field vegetative buffers on downward slopes. You've got field borders, a border with dense vegetative stands with a minimum width of 30. There's 2 points. Cover crops are worth 2 points. Vegetative barriers are worth 2 points. You've got buffer strips or terraces on the field, grassed waterways. You got water sediment basins, contour farming or contour strip cropping. There's a lot of ways to rack up points, and in most scenarios, we can get there. And this is to mitigate runoff again. So not necessarily talking about driftable fines or volatility here, because the Enlist system does that naturally. But if we're looking for runoff to those sensitive areas that we're trying to protect. In summary, I'd say just think of this as a system. It's a system approach. and we're proud to provide it to the marketplace and proud to continue to battle these tough to control weeds with you. If there's any questions, I think we've got about 3 minutes for last questions. And I see one that we can answer live. Does a drift reduction agent negatively alter Enlist One as far as effectiveness or chemical composition? Adding additional DRAs doesn't necessarily negate the effect of Enlist. But I would say, the more DRA you have in the tank mix, especially if you have, 10 gallon of water, the more DRA, the lower the water. Sometimes you can get those droplets a little bit bigger than we'd ideally like. So in general, we don't need a DRA with the Enlist system, but we don't ban it. We're not saying you can't use a DRA if you're in an area where you want extra protection with a DRA in the tank. So in general, yes, you can add it. It's not going to negatively affect the Enlist system, but there are situations where we can get those droplets a little bit too big if we have the concoction a little bit off.
I see another one that says growth stage limit for soybeans is R1. In a bean field, there's a wide range of growth stages. What happens if Enlist is applied to plants that are past R1?
Yeah, we're gonna resort to the label here. The label is gonna say R1, but the system, when it originally came out, it was through R2. But today the label is R1 due to the ESA mitigation strategies that were put in place. So crop tolerance is extremely good throughout the life cycle. Our label is R1 to make sure we're not drifting or volatilizing on the sensitive crops that may be growing in nearby areas at that time of year. So understand the difference in the field. R1 is kind of what we can talk about here on with our current label.
Got
I see
another
one. Why do you want higher pressure for spraying? So increasing your pressure, not, you got to stay on label within the recommended range for each nozzle that you're using. But when you find your nozzle, you're going to see the pressure range that you can use with that nozzle. By going to the upper third of that pressure range, you're just going to have, smaller droplets, better penetration into the crop canopy. And I mean, that's the main two, a little bit smaller droplets, and we're not getting big golf ball sized droplets that we're throwing out there. It's just adequate pressure for proper agronomic weed control is kind of what we're after there with the higher pressure range.
All right, it looks like we are reaching the end of our time for the call. Thanks again to everybody for joining us today and for y'all's engagement. If y'all have any additional questions, please feel free to reach out to your local Corteva representatives and they can get you taken care of. But again, thank y'all for joining us and have a great day.